This video will explain the key ideas in chapter 3 from the Johnson text, the chapter entitled Capitalism, Class, and the Matrix of Domination. So I'm not going to go through the first part of the chapter where he just explains how capitalism works. So hopefully that was a fairly reasonable review for you if you weren't aware of all of these things. What I want to talk about are some of the ideas in that chapter that might have been more new to you. And the main thing is this idea that there is some very obvious connections between capitalism and, he calls it, white racism. You could also you could call it, basically it's the systems of privilege and oppression. So they're both direct and indirect ways that capitalism connects to privilege and oppression. So some of the direct ways. So to start off with, the system of chattel slavery. There's very direct ties between capitalism and the system of chattel slavery. They were very interested, chattel slavery was great for capitalism because it meant there could be all of this labor that was, very, very cheap. In a sense, almost free. Once you fed the slaves, and past their initial purchase point, then they would just make more slaves for you, which you could then sell or keep using yourself. So it was a very, very economically profitable way of organizing labor. Now, the Civil War put an end to that, but we, as we talked about, when we talked about sort of the history of racism in the United States and chattel slavery and what came after that, the Jim Crow era, we see that tenant farming, or sharecropping as it was called, was another way of just basically continuing the use of African Americans as cheap labor, as very cheap labor. Also, immigrant labor was used, and that was, again, also very, very cheap. And then Johnson also talks about the acquisition of land and raw materials. So, how we took land from the Indians, how the British colonized all of these countries. All of these are direct ties between capitalism and racism. So we have acquired land and raw materials in racist and oppressive ways. Okay. And then also just this whole idea of the development of the idea of whiteness as a way to justify the above forms of exploitation. So the idea of whiteness as superior. And to reconcile this exploitation with the ideals of democracy and freedom. So it was okay to exploit African Americans or immigrants and that was okay in this framework of democracy and freedom because democracy and freedom were for white people, and white people were better. So these are some very direct ways that capitalism has sort of worked together with society and helped create a racist society, a society that is full, to this day, of privilege and oppression. There are also indirect ways that capitalism has connected. So some of the indirect ways is that capitalists used racism as a strategy to control white workers and to keep them satisfied with low wages. So this is what Alexander talks about with the racial bribe. It's the same thing. And we saw that blacks and other minorities were used as strike breakers or as inexpensive replacements for white workers. And so this kept white workers satisfied with lower wages than they would have maybe otherwise been satisfied with, because you could always use the threat that if they didn't accept these low wages, that blacks or other minorities would be hired to take their place. And if they tried to strike and unionize, they would bring in blacks and other minorities to do the work, making their strike ineffective. Okay, and then Johnson also talks about some other ways that capitalism is exploitative. So he talks about ways that the disabled are exploited. So they're exempt from a lot of the labor laws. So if you hire someone who's disabled, you don't have to pay them a minimum wage like you would have to pay anyone else. Capitalism and gender inequality lead to devaluation of women's work, both at home and in the workplace. So in the home, the work that women do in the home is with raising the children and taking care of the family is very, very necessary to keep this capitalist system going. Without their labor, which is basically unpaid, it's free labor, the men who go off to work wouldn't have the support of their wives and taking care of them and taking care of the family. And the women also raise the next generation of workers. And then we also see in the workplace, the work that women do is not valued equally. So people feel justified in paying them less and in valuing the work that they do. And another way that, another sort of exploitative work practice, I think, is prison labor. So prison labor, they pay the prisoners very, very little. They pay them on par with what you would pay a worker, that was work that was outsourced to a third country, to a third world country. And, this is quite literally a captive workforce. And it works in with the fact that prison labor is also disproportionately African Americans and other minorities also, feeds into this racist system. So Johnson doesn't talk about prison labor, but I think he should, because I think that's another important aspect of how capitalist labor practices can be exploitative. Okay, and then in this chapter, Johnson also talks about the matrix of domination, and he talks again about the paradox of being privileged and unprivileged at the same time. So Johnson refers to it as a matrix of domination because all the different forms of domination are interlinked, and people can occupy multiple places on the spectrum of privilege and oppression. And so it's not just, sort of this loose collection of privileges. They work together in important ways. And again, he goes over how people can be both privileged and unprivileged at the same time. And that's because they could have some privileges, but then they could lack other privileges. And so they are both privileged and unprivileged. And that's most people. Some people lack a lot of types of privileges, but most people have some privileges, but maybe lack others. Okay, and then a final thing, which Johnson doesn't talk about in the text, but is sort of a natural question to ask, having read this chapter, and if capitalism is so problematic, and if it's so intimately tied up with this system of privilege and oppression, we might want to ask ourselves, well, what are the alternatives? So if not capitalism, then what? So here's an interesting chart that I found, and it shows two different distributions of wealth. We have Society A, where the richest 20% have 36% of the wealth. The middle have 18%, and then there's the rest of society. Or we could have Society B, which has the richest 20% have 84% of the wealth. The middle have 4%, and then there's everyone else. And so there was a study done by Harvard and Duke where analysts gave 5,000 Americans these two pictures, but unlabeled, just Society A and Society B. They didn't tell them what societies they were, and they asked them, which would you choose to live in if you were able to choose? And so by a 92 to 8% margin, Americans preferred Society A. Well, as you can see from the picture, Society A is a picture of contemporary Sweden, whereas Society B is us. That's the USA. So Johnson has an answer to, if not capitalism, then what? And his answer is basically it's democratic socialism, which is what Sweden has. So democratic socialism it's socialism, but everything is voted on by the people. So if there's going to be some socialist practice put in place, let's say like Medicare, that's a socialist practice in our country. It would be voted on by the people, and exactly how it would work could be voted on. Or it would be voted on by, the people's representatives. But the point is, it would be really no different than what we have, except that what we would have in place would be more social programs. And probably in higher taxation. And that's how you'd get a more equitable distribution of wealth. If you tax the people who have more, if you tax them higher, instead of what we have, which is all kinds of loopholes and tax benefits that specifically benefit corporations and the rich. And this is interesting in the country now because this is basically what Bernie Sanders is proposing. He's a democratic socialist. And so that's the sort of policies and laws that he would like to see put in place if he's president. And what this Duke Harvard study shows is that 92% of Americans would actually prefer this type of society that he's proposing. So that's interesting. Would that make our entire system of privilege and oppression just go away? No, it's not going to make it go away, especially not overnight. But over time, it could help a lot. It would certainly help with some of the issues that we're looking at this week, which are classism and poverty.